Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Weedman. I missed you guys. It's been a long time since I've seen you. So I'm not sure what things look like going forward next week, but I thought today and tomorrow I would just finish out this marriage backstory. We've been doing a lot of history work on the Sacrament of marriage. So I thought I'd finish that out so that when I see you, hopefully next week, that we can just jump right back in to our next piece on our work on the Sacrament of marriage. So anyway, I hope you and your families are all doing well, and you're healthy and enjoying the extra rest. So for this class, let me just be very clear. My expectation is that you watch the video and that you take notes just like we would do in class into your notebooks. If for any reason you didn't bring your notebook home, just go ahead and write them down on a piece of paper. You can attach or insert that paper into your notebook. I will be doing a notebook check for these notes when I see you next in class, hopefully next week. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in really quickly. We'll start with a review, and then I think I'm just going to pick up around the early church material because I think for both Block A and Block C, that's what we left off with. All right, if you remember when we talked about love and what it is, we've been talking about this sort of background here. But as an institution in practice, we've talked about, I'm kind of set you up to understand that marriage has had a complicated history as a sacrament. And one of the things that's important for us to understand, not only in terms of current theology and current practice within our Catholic faith, is to understand where this sacrament has been and how it's evolved and changed as the human experience and our understanding of the revelation and the Holy Spirit continue to also deepen. So we started with our 6 or 7 terms of Greek terms for love. Please make sure you're reviewing these. These are super important. They're going to really come into play next week and in the following lecture. So remember, we have eros, ludus, philia, agape, pragma, storge, and philotia. These are the 7 Greek terms for love. English doesn't do a lot for us with this. They kind of get, it doesn't help us kind of get these sort of distinctions, but these kinds of distinctions are in play in the New Testament and certainly in early church conversations about marriage, about love, and the Christian understanding of them. And that's really important for us for understanding the theology of this. Okay, last but not least, just remember when you're thinking about your definitions of love in the Christian imagination, in the Christian way of thinking, there are 3 important conditions to love and our understanding of love. 1, it has to be self-gift. So the totality of the self, both mind and body, willed. That means it has to be a choice. You can't be pushed into something or under duress for it to be valid, and it has to be free. That refers to the kind of no strings or no conditions on love. And again, our big example of that, is, especially in the New Testament, is the crucifixion, right? As a form of that kind of love, that complete self-gift, the will in terms of choice, and free, that there are no conditions put on anybody, that love was just freely given. So in my favorite definition, or one of them I shared with you, was from A.A. Milne and Winnie the Pooh. So moving right along, in terms of our review, we talked about this in terms of the Hebrew Bible, how important the concept of covenant is, in the development of not only concepts of the relationship between God and his people, but also becoming a kind of important way, especially as the rubric of relationship between God and his people in the Hebrew Bible changes from a master-servant, parent-child, to a spousal model, especially when we're looking at that literature in Hosea, etc. That spousal model becomes the background of the language for folks like Paul, who will use marriage as a metaphor for thinking about the relationship of Christ and the church. So it's always kind of there. It builds some of the imagination and the background for it. So it's there. We also talked about in class, how important marriage is in terms of even Judaic practice. I cited Jonathan Sacks. Rabbi Sacks is the lead rabbi in the synagogues of England. And, you know, he has quite a few writings about marriage, is particularly its place in the history of Judaism. And it's important to look at that because that really helps us open up our own foundations. Remember, those first century folks that are part of what will become the Christian movement are all Jews. So they're bringing forward these really important symbols and these really important concepts that are going to be building blocks and pieces for forming our own Christian understanding of marriage. And you do see that in the catechetical and theological language of the church materials. So we talked about Genesis 2:24. We also talked about what polygamy was. It's certainly a practice that we see in Torah and patriarchal materials. We also see, though, by around the first century, there is a kind of I wouldn't say it's completely standardized, but certainly it's much more in the center of the practice of monogamy. And then you're starting to see, especially around the temple and temple practice, Second Temple Judaism, you're starting to see the blessings and certain rites or ceremonies happening. There's a kind of ritualization. And the importance of that ritualization is that it's not just always happening in the civic sphere. Remember, in the Roman Empire, marriage still operates for lots of socioeconomic reasons. And it didn't really matter what your particular religious tradition was. And therefore, it was really something governed by the state. So that applied to Jews. And then, of course, it will apply to Christians as well. But, we're starting to see that there's some ritualization taking place within the sacred practices too. So that's important in terms of just a little bit of our history. Then we move into the New Testament. One of the things that we see really quickly is that Jesus doesn't have a lot to say about marriage. And I kind of gave you guys a little hint that this would play into some big Christian debates about the place of marriage, both within sacramental life and sacramental practice, but also the role of marriage as a path to holiness. There's been quite heated debate for several centuries. And really in recent times, we've seen popes like John Paul II who take a definitive place in that and saying, hey, marriage is a pathway to sainthood and to holiness, and demonstrating through our own history and through our own theological tradition how we look at that. But I just want you to be aware, one of the ways in which that debate really sparked is that in the Gospels, we don't really get a lot. We talked about Mark 10, where the concern here by Jesus looks like primarily on the widows. I'm making sure that women who would have been a marginalized or vulnerable group, as well as children of these marriages, really were protected because they, by both the civic as well as secular traditions of the time, would not have had or been afforded many protections. They didn't have a lot of say in their marriages. They didn't have a lot of say in legal, economic, or social practices as they would have been experienced by the wide majority. So, it's just an important thing to keep in mind. And Jesus seems to be, when he talks about it, making sure the vulnerable and marginalized within the marriage and the families are protected. Of course, then we get to Matthew and Luke, and what they're interested in here in Matthew and Luke is grounds for divorce. There's a question for that. We also get a question about, well, in heaven, will marriages be part of that reality? That's also in Matthew. And then probably the most famous of all the marriage talk is the wedding at Cana. But again, the wedding itself is not what's the focus. It's sort of the backdrop for this miracle. But one of the things that's really beautiful about it, and that you see does come into the language, you see it in a modern wedding ceremony, wine, right, in Hebrew tradition, and then it's carried forward within Christian tradition. It's a sign of joy. The banquet, very early out of the gate, we have second and third century writers who are talking about the banquet itself. You even see this in beautiful Christian art as a metaphor for the marriage or the unification of heaven and earth, particularly this is kind of giving us a sense of what the purpose of Christ and his role is. And then finally, that the saving act of Christ in terms of all of humanity and saving us from our shame is paralleled by this saving act of Jesus at this wedding at the urging of his mom to save the couple and save the families from a public shame that they would bear for not having enough wine and for this important celebration, this public celebration. Okay, then the next thing we looked at was Paul. We jumped into Paul, and I've already mentioned this, so I won't dwell on it. With Paul, we see there's quite a few different debates there, but Paul uses marriage, like he does a lot of social institutions and relationships, as a way to help people understand who Jesus is and what his relationship is to the world or to the church. And so you see marriage operating in that kind of theological sphere. Again, not really talking about marriage in and of itself, but assuming marriage as a part of human experience. Remember, Paul is working with non-Jews or Gentiles, so he's latching on to this common social practice and using it to communicate a really important theological message about Jesus. Okay, so we took a little time. We're going to come back to this part. We'll do this together in class. But if you would like to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, then, and I know 2 of the classes got through this work. We haven't got to do our discussion for it. I'm hoping that's what we get to do when I see you Monday or Tuesday of next week. Just when you're looking at that and you're thinking about it, in Ephesians 5, verse 21 through chapter 6, verse 9, it's a really pretty famous passages, and there's been a lot of ink spilled theologically on these passages, but I want you to just pay attention. What are the key relationships Paul's using? Now, remember, he takes these sort of everyday, common human experience relationships and then uses those as a mechanism to teach these kind of very difficult at times ideas about who Jesus is and what the uniqueness of this new relationship is, and that he has brought into the world. And he's making a connection here. And I say here, give you a little bit of a hint, he's inverting those common relationships. So when you come back, we're going to talk about this explicitly. We'll be back in our little small pod groups to do that. So don't worry about this in terms of your notes or anything. I'm acknowledging that we're going to do that work together. So some other New Testament mention, this you do want to put in your notes, by the way. Other New Testament mentions, we get some later writings, especially stuff that is from the emerging church. So we're in the post-apostolic moments. We're in that the year 100, so the 2nd century stuff. And we're seeing that the structure of the church is taking shape. And one of the structures that's being defined is leadership. So we're in the early church period here, like super early. Jesus has passed away, and now we've got this 150, 200 years. And some of these writings are reflecting some of the conversations as they try to figure out what this religion and this community looks like. So in 1 Timothy, we get some instructions about the bishops, and a bishop can only be married one time, and deacons can only be married one time. That's pretty much the upshot of what 1 Timothy wants to say about marriage. Then in Titus, we get this, there's some character pieces that they outline for leaders of the church. And then in terms of marriage, they reiterate what we saw in 1 Timothy, that a leader of a church can only be married one time. That's all we get there. So starts the debates. All right. So because Jesus has so little to say, and the New Testament writers seem only to be concerned about it in terms of its practice and how that practice bears weight in terms of behavior or ethical life, in its leadership or even in its membership. So couples or folks that are married in particular communities, and practices for separations or divorces. We don't really have a lot of information about the institution of marriage. And that sparks a lot of debates, because parallel to, what's happening in this early church movement is, a form of asceticism that will also develop into monasticism. But one of the big qualities or elements of the ascetical life that's developing out of this early Christian movement is a emphasis on celibacy or an emphasis on virginity. And that will lead some people in and some groups within the Christian community. This is going to last for centuries to put a priority on that. And it kind of moves marriage. And remember now, marriage isn't a sacrament. It's not a sacred practice. It's still in the civic sphere. It's going to move marriage down. And so in terms of as a Christian pathway to holiness. So really, as I say here in the notes, it's over for a millennium. It's really debated whether marriage is a sacrament at all. You can find everybody in the debate, like a pretty wide spectrum. And there's no specific rite for marriage in the early church. We just don't have those materials. The first detailed, in fact, description of a Christian wedding ceremony shows up in the 9th century. So we're talking about the 800s. What marriage is primarily a civil action that would have been administered by the Roman state. That would have been even true prior to the 1st century. Within Judaism, marriage would have been under the civic sphere. So whoever's in charge, whatever empire, but the Roman state is the one that the Christian tradition emerges out of and through. And so only until we get to Constantine, and you might have remembered Constantine from a previous lecture sorry, I just blanked, in his own conversion with baptism and reconciliation and things like that. Christianity, if you remember though, under him becomes the religion of the empire. And as such, you do start to see deacons and priests and some bishops become local clerks. The word cleric comes from that Roman word, in which they become ministers. They work for the state, but they oversee these kind of civic functions of presiding over marriages, wills, things like that. So that's where we start to see something kind of happening. But again, note that there's no specific rite for it in terms as a Christian tradition. It's still in the auspices of the civic sphere. However, under the Coda Justinian, which is in the 6th century, we start to see some codified rules of marriage. Religion, however, is mentioned only one time. Religion doesn't come in at all with regard to marriage in these codes, except for this: Christians couldn't marry Jews. And there's a lot of stuff, it's not pertinent necessarily to what we're getting into here, but that certainly starts only piece of information that we get with regard to marriage and these codes around marriage that has anything to do with religion and sacred rite is just that there's no interfaith marriage allowed between these two religious traditions. All right, so moving right on along. In the Coda Justinian, however, the code does become kind of important because it does give the basis for a lot of contemporary systems of civil law. Those of you that are going to be my future lawyers and my future public servants, you're going to study this stuff potentially in one of your university settings. Coda Justinian does come up. So some of the things it does include, it sets an age. We see that in our own religious and theological conversation. What is an age in which someone can be married? Now, that can change even in our own country. It's regulated by our states. And those laws are still changing. My home state of North Carolina just changed the law from age of marriage is 14. I think they moved it to 16 or 17. That was within the last couple of years. So, but it's an important conversation of how old you have to be before you can be married. Consent. This is an interesting one. Remember that for most of Roman tradition, women of any class needed a patriarch's consent. They needed whomever, their father, and if they didn't have a father, an elder brother or uncle, but you needed a patriarch's consent. Women could not, because their status was not legally binding. It did not have economic impact. They had to have the consent of the person whom had the legal priority there. So intermarriage was another one that came up. So how marriages between different classes or social status might have worked. Children. Remember, children were thought of as property. And so this outlines what the obligations of a father primarily were to their children, and what rules a father had over how and when they could exchange their children in marriage. This also had rules in it. The codes had rules in it for illegitimate children and what access or claims they had on inheritance, what they didn't. Inheritance was also for children regularly. Divorce and remarriage, what that could and could not be. And again, as I said, the only one that mentions religion specifically was that Christians could not marry Jews. So the takeaway here in the codes of Justinian is that we do get a codification of marriage with certain obligations, who has what obligations to whom, the rights, who has rights, who doesn't have rights, and what the penalties are when people don't meet those expectations or obligations. We also start to see a little more formulation and a little more crystallization around the role of a cleric, and including those that are religious clerics. So if you were a Christian priest, bishop, or deacon who was stepping into this role, who worked for the Roman state in this, what your particular code of ethics or code of obligations would be on behalf of the state. One thing also to note here, by 400 CE, so this is the 5th century, there was a new law that required all clerics to have their marriages blessed by a priest. So that was an interesting law that showed up there. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, the church is going to emerge as the governing authority over marriage. Same things with wills and other kind of what we'd say are the socio-cultural institutions and practices that bind groups and families together. They are the ruling governing piece on that, even like contracts between businesses and things. So these were where the courts and where the judicial practices would become established. This is especially true in the West. So that by the 5th and 6th century, you do have some evidence of blessing ceremonies around marriages or at a wedding feast. It wasn't actually in the church proper, but at the wedding feast. But most historians that do this kind of work say that these blessings even were restricted to nobility or the ruling class. Okay. As we keep going, then there's this guy named Charlemagne. This is where the drama happens, guys. Okay, so if you haven't gotten some popcorn or a snack or something yet, you need to hit pause on this, run grab it, because we're about to do like a lot of drama. For those of you that like this sort of stuff. Any case, all right. So there's this French ruler. His name is Charlemagne, and he's divorced once, and then he's widowed 3 times. Don't ask questions. He has many concubines. And in the process of all this, he attempts to enforce a law requiring marriage to have the blessing of a priest. What this does is this just starts a huge old debate, like just it blows up. And he doesn't quite get his way with this, but what it does do is start a shift. It kind of starts to build a kind of conversation amongst theologians of the time that's going to go forward, that begins seeing marriage as a means of holiness. That's super important, because up until this point, we're not seeing that. And the primacy or emphasis in terms of the means of holiness is through celibacy and virginity. So marriage is not on that radar. So just, it's important in that what he gets started. And then in the 9th century, a big old fight just kind of blows up, and it's mostly driven by money. But these clan claims, it's a pretty tumultuous time anyway in certain parts of the western part of the European what's modern Europe now. Anyway, there's all these squabbles over different land claims between wives and priests, and so there's a whole situation with illegitimate heirs and who has claim and who doesn't. In the short, there's all kinds of drama. Boy, you thought your family gatherings could be crazy, but what comes out of it in terms of for our conversation is a lot of important clarification and beginning of clarification for how marriage worked and who had authority over it. its governance and its institution. So that leads us to this guy named Lothar II. I expect all of you to name your firstborn Lothar. It's a great name. In any case, he becomes, most people, when they think about the craziness of marriage drama and heirs and land claims, they all go to Henry VIII, which is totally legitimate. And if you have not heard of Six yet, great Broadway musical. My kids are obsessed with it. But that's all about Henry VIII's wives. But Lothar too is the pre-Henry. He is the prototype for Henry. So here's what's going on. He's trying to annul his marriage with a woman named Queen Thutberga. She can't have children, or has no children. Now, again, that's another name to put on your baby name list for those of you that will have the vocation of marriage. And so in any case, so he could marry his mistress, Waldrada, who is the mother of several of his children. Told you this was all like some major gossip, right? He ends up imprisoning his queen and accusing her of incest. Now he's accusing her of this for grounds for annulment. Meanwhile, he goes to a bunch of other kings who are kind of watching the drama and see that maybe there's a potential for a power grab. And they all get together with King Lothar and host a local synod. The same word that we're using right now for the synod that's happening. This is where you get heads together of any particular institution and have this sort of listening and kind of gathering of information. In any case, he appeals to them, Lothar does, to grant him an annulment, and they do. However, Thutberga escapes and she heads off to find Pope Nicholas II, who gathers up his own tribunal and then orders Lothar to take her back under the threat of excommunication. Told you, right? Love the drama. So he does. He consents and takes Thutberga back. However, she agrees to the annulment a while later, because I imagine living with someone who has imprisoned you, falsely accused you of a pretty awful crime, and then has tried to just basically get rid of you. I don't want to stick around. So Lothar then takes off to Rome and he says, I'm going to find a new pope. And he does, Adrian II. And through Adrian II, he obtains an annulment. Here's the plot twist. He's on his way back from Rome and he dies and he has no legitimate heir for his kingdom. So the whole reason that he really wanted to marry Waldrada was to legitimize those children of hers that were his as the legitimate heirs to his kingdom and all the lands. So what this does is it creates this vacuum and this power grab that ends up leaving his kingdom completely vulnerable to all the neighboring kings who promptly jump in and take all the land. Okay, why are we talking about, even though this is some juicy stuff, why are we bothering with King Lothar? Here's what it is. There are a couple things. What holds for kings, remember this, what holds for a king will hold for their subjects. And through all of this matter, all this drama this is some soap opera special here, is that the church has power over the matters of marriage. And that was solidified in this whole debacle, this whole craziness between heirs and land and whatever, right? At the end of the day, what it gives us is an understanding of who is in charge of marriage and how those mechanisms work and who has governance. Now, remember, it's still not a sacrament, but the church is in charge of this social institution, not the state. That's what Lothar was going on. That's why I say it's kind of the prototype of Henry VIII. And remember, when we get to Henry VIII, which is, he starts the Second Reformation. You have the Reformation on the European continent, and then you have the English Reformation, right, in which he starts as a way to basically legitimize an heir. Britain had just come out of this, awful civil war, and he steps into the role of king on the heels of this just devastating civil war, which was this power grab for, ruling power and land. And it left England incredibly vulnerable to other kingdoms. So Henry Henry's whole upshot, like him or love him, there is a legitimate concern for him about making sure we don't have this kind of vacuum. Now, how Henry solves it is he makes himself the head of the church, and this is the beginning of the Anglican Church. But we'll get to that another day. All right. So the 10th century going forward is kind of interesting here. So after all those things, what we start to see is that marriages become almost, in terms of practice, uniformly blessed by local clergy. What's interesting here is that they can have a mass or not have a mass to follow. The marriage takes place often at the doors of the church. So notice, right? Like all the other sacraments we've studied, they happen like there's even an entrance, and that's part of the ceremonial rite and the processing. This is not true for marriage. They exchange their vows often in public on the door church. Now, part of that was it is a public space. Churches were tended to be in the center of towns. Those of you that will one day, when COVID is a distant memory or it's less of the issue that it is for us today, and things start traveling and you're able to go to older parts of the world, you'll notice that a lot of towns are built centrally around older towns and cities around a church, even little communities and squares if they're a super big city. Same here. If you had like a public announcement, you would often pin them to the doors of the church or around that area so that people could see it, because that's sort of how it formed. So they exchanged their vows. You can actually still see that in cities like Paris and Rome today. People still kind of do that. Couples take pictures out in the front in this area. There are places in Germany. I attended a wedding that was very similar to this in Munich. In any case, they exchange their vows at the door of the church, and then they enter into the church for the blessing of the marriage or a nuptial mass. So the mass was celebrated there, or a blessing happened, but, as a sacrament, it wasn't acknowledged still. Then in the 12th century, we get another big old brouhaha argument about marriage and whether it should be made a sacrament. And it got really vocal. But to cut to the chase, again, these kinds of dialogues, which is one of the reasons I really, really emphasize learning the history of our sacraments as part of our understanding of sacramental theology, is that these conversations are so important, and they are still going on. This stuff is not things that are just dusty and done and put on a shelf. The work is always continuing in terms of our revelation and our understanding of how these sacraments reveal and create encounters with Christ for us. So two big contributors to these debates, so that in terms of ideas, the things that are kind of underpinning all the arguments. One, the priority of celibacy. I've already mentioned that as part of the history. You really have a strong vocal group, and you have a strong vocal tradition in which celibacy and virginity are the paths to holiness within the church, that understood marriage as kind of a distraction. But then on the other side, you have people that are like, hey, marriage from the gate was used as a visual sign of the spiritual marriage of Christ and the church. Hey guys, it's been there the whole time. It's just not the ways that, say baptism or Eucharist were instituted, but it was presumed in a way. So you kind of got these two big debates, and the marriage as a sacrament group, they win. Marriage was declared a sacrament in 1184 at the Council of Verona as the seventh sacrament. Now we've only done 6. I'm going to go back and do priesthood with you, but it becomes the seventh sacrament of the church at 1184 at the Council of Verona. All right. So thanks to Charlemagne and all those things, we get this stuff. So now going forward from the Council of Verona, we really start to see the sacrament start to take shape when it finally becomes recognized as a path to holiness, as a place in which persons can encounter Christ and share in the development and the wisdom and their own heavenly life, that this is a vocational path for folks. You really see this start to take shape. So, You get ministers of marriage declared as the couple. So the couple is the one. This is very different than some of the other sacraments we've studied. The couple is the one that call the Holy Spirit. The clergy serve as the witnesses, and you get a lot more clarity about what elements um, constitute a marriage, and they shape around consent, the mind, and consummation, the body. So like right now, if I know in a few weeks we'll do some theology of the body as per the curriculum. You see mind and body are used all over the place by John Paul II and other theologians that he's drawing from to form this important teaching. Where they're getting that are all these conversations around consent and consummation, meaning, right, that the dignity of our personhood, right, the unity of our body, which is how we express our soul, right, and both are necessary and have to be present to and engage for the sacrament to take. It's true in all the sacraments, but marriage has its unique quality. So this is also where, conversations around sex and uh, marital life begin to also develop. So that's where you start to see all kinds of ways these conversations are happening. I have mentioned to you that, there are conversations ongoing right now because, even when we think about consent, remember for a majority of history, especially since most of us are working out of Western concepts as Americans of history, groups like women and children, even in a sacrament of marriage, the way the church approached that and what that might have meant for those persons, has been impacted by history and movements and science and discovery, as well as social understanding of humanity and what dignity looks like for persons that maybe not have been represented in how the church thinks about the sacramental life. And so certainly marriage is one of those. And so you see that there are conversations happening even under the synod that's happening right now, but also special committees in the Vatican and things like that. So just keeping it out there, make sure if you're not following these conversations on local religious news, you should, because it's important to know that as part of your faith work and your faith obligation. Pope Innocent III comes out and declares that anyone who did not hold this teaching that should be would, not wold. I apologize for the typo there, be excommunicated. So he's kind of drawing the line in the sand there for folks that would reject marriage as a path for holiness. And at the Fourth Lateran Council, that's in 1215, this is just really briefly more drama because there's so much. We should really do church history classes. They're so much fun. The Carthers are this group that leads a kind of intellectual and theological revolution. And the upshot of it is that there's a kind of duality that they approach with, and it rejects the body. So you can imagine this gets them in a lot of trouble for a lot of things in terms of Christianity. Most importantly, that rejecting the body and the physical world kind of rejects Jesus, who was fully human. Needless to say, there's a whole hot water situation. It also has a bunch of political stuff that's not important to us. Here's where it is in terms of marriage. Because they have this duality, and then there's a kind of rejection of the physical world, that takes a hit on marriage. Marriage as a life is a really much a physically lived life. I say this as not just as a married person who's chosen that particular vocation, but also as a mom. That's part of that vocation. To say that is not physical, and I don't mean just in terms of pregnancy, I mean that in terms of raising children, and that's true for the other Dr. Weidman, for him, right? That it is a lot on the body and the self, and it has to be fully engaged. You see this even in the relationships between siblings and creation of families, and how important the physical world is to the expressions of love as a sign of God's love, and marriage as that sign. So the Cathars get in a lot of trouble, and they're excommunicated for this reason, because they do reject that marriage can be a pathway to holiness. Their arguments follow some of the distraction arguments that you see earlier, and then they layer it with these that, particularly around sex and the distractions of marriage and those things kind of gets them in a lot of trouble. Okay, so then by the time we get to the 13th century, we have Pope Alexander the Fourth. He enacted canons against arranged marriages. This is interesting because we haven't seen anybody kind of doing this before. Part of this and the argument is maintaining the sanctity and the sacredness of marriage and removing from it the common, and I mean very, very, very common practice of it being an economic and social and political mechanism. So he's the upshot of all this work in some ways is a way to kind of just separate out the way that we think about marriage and really put the primacy on its holiness and its sacred place in the Christian life. Then in the 16th century, this is when you get the Reformation. Remember, Martin Luther is part of the European Reformation. He and other Protestant reformers, especially on the European continent, we've already talked about Henry VIII, who's going to follow a couple years later with the Second Reformation in England. They're going to reject all the sacraments except for two. Now, there's a whole lot of conversation around that, but one of them that they reject is marriage. And one of the things that they put in that is that marriage belongs to the sphere of the state. Even though you may have friends and family that are members of Christian traditions that, you know, celebrate weddings in their churches and in their sacred communities, the primary piece of that is that the minister or the pastor is standing in for the state. And there's a blessing. So they're kind of going back to that kind of undefined time where there may be a blessing, but it's not really a sacrament. And the primary argument is that they're looking at the Gospels and they're looking at New Testament and they just don't see whatever for their criteria, what they say is instituted by Christ as necessary. Something to be important, something to be taken seriously, but they really say this is a matter of the state and where the states are. I bring this up because I think this is where sometimes in our modern 2022 society, especially when you're looking at Christian dialogue about marriage, especially when they're thinking about it in the variety of social issues that exist, and as the Catholic voice or even an Orthodox voice, sometimes, and then with our Protestant brothers and sisters, how you kind of got all these different things. My advice to you when you're looking at that is to just remember, you know, think about how those particular traditions embrace these institutions and their history of these institutions, because I think that helps us at least understand where they're coming from and when they're making their particular arguments. And I think that's a really important step that's sometimes overlooked in so many of these, we're going to call it politely, conversations, is not understanding how we're formed and what sometimes categories that we're working with that we haven't taken our time to think about. That's one of the values. You thank your parents and all those folks that have gifted you with a Catholic education for you're getting a chance to think about it in a class like this one. So, and other classes that you have here at Catholic. So, you know, that's going to be an important move. And I think you certainly see that contributing to lines of thinking and ideas about marriage's place. And again, it sparks more debate about how then our paths to holiness for persons that are married and established in family lives. All right. Then at the Council of Trent in 1547, it's reaffirmed that marriage as a sacrament. And we get the church's confirmed authority. So Council of Trent, remember, has got a lot of stuff happening. It's primarily a big old response to what's going on in the Reformation with the Protestant leaders. And there's a lot of things that happen, like they close the canon of scripture. And then this is one of the things that marriage is declared again, just reaffirmed as a sacrament. But the big one is the church's place in terms of its authority over it. All right, we're at the end, gang. So I just want to wind us up and we'll finish this here. What I just want you to take away from this is, I feel like I'm singing the same song in different notes, but this stuff's complicated. And the history of marriage as a sacrament has undergone a lot of change. And the work is still going on as we clarify and more deeply understand its place as a path of holiness and how it is an expression of the unification of heaven and earth, how men and women that have engaged in these lives and this particular path stand as witnesses, stand as saintly witnesses to what Christ has accomplished for us in this life, in the next. So but it's part of human experience, and as such, it's got a lot of work to be done and has been done on it. So a couple takeaways from this entire presentation we've now had to drag out, unfortunately, for 2 weeks, is that marriage had some moves. It begins in the civic or secular practice or sphere, and then it moves into being a full and true sacrament. As I say here, a sign of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the church, by which divine life is dispensed to us. Marriage is a means to holiness. And I shared with you at the beginning of this, one of the most recent saints that was very powerful in his support of married persons and the sanctification and canonization of married persons was John Paul II. In terms of just how marriages are practiced, weddings are public events, and they are performed by a priest with 2 witnesses. In our next presentation, so next week, I am going to give you a heads up. I have to do some training, and then I'm on the junior retreat. So I'll probably be forming a few more videos like this for those days in class. I will remind you to bring your headphones and your computers or phones to class so you can watch the lecture individually and take your notes, because I realized with the training that I'm doing, and then in addition to helping out with retreats, I potentially am going to miss up to 4 or 5 classes in the coming quarter, which is a lot, especially for you guys in A block. It's really going to hit you more than anyone else. So I'm going to try to make sure that we don't fall too far behind, that by the time we get to our last quarter, we're into the good stuff with our ethical dialogue. But in marriage, we've got maybe a week and a half left. And so we're going to look at the actual elements of a Catholic marriage ceremony. We'll talk about form and matter and all those things. As always, please make sure you just reach out to me if you have any questions whatsoever. Make sure the stuff's in your notes. I'm going to do a notebook check next week. And one last reminder is to make sure that you have completed part 1 of PRE number 4, which is located on Teams under the assignments. Remember, you only have to do part 1. That is due tonight by 11:59. Your notes for this presentation are due next week. So Monday, Tuesday, whenever our class schedule rotation meets, Dr. Weidman can't keep up with this. Have these notes in your notebook so you can divide them up. You can do this part time, a little bit here, a little bit there, however works best for you. Always reach out to me though if you're not understanding something here in Teams. All right, gang, I miss you all. I hope you're safe. I hope you're healthy. You remain in my prayers. And if you need anything at all, just reach out. All right, talk to you later. Take care.